Good morning, everybody. On behalf of exida and exida Academy, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. The topic will be cybersecurity metrics. The issue often with cybersecurity is, what do I measure? How do I tell how well I'm doing with regards to my security profile? So today's talk will center on that and then use the international standards, the IEC 62443, and the requirements that are contained in there as a framework to help you identify and select what metrics might be most beneficial and valuable to you in your program. So first, who's exida? Exida consulting company. We've got offices around the globe, consultants in many countries, focused at the enterprise level, doing a lot industrial control systems and the safety focus. Lifecycle services across the entire lifecycle, from origin of a design all the way through operations, with a big component focus on certifications and assessments of different plants and different operating conditions. In doing that, we've done an awful lot of reference material generation, primarily focused on safety, reliability. Over the last few years, cybersecurity has come more to the forefront, and our focus has been on making sure cybersecurity and any mitigations and issues there don't impact your functional safety. So we've done a lot of books and reference material generation. Most recently, we've done this pragmatic approach to cybersecurity. I've got this just released beginning of October here. Should be able to find that on your Amazon bookseller, I'm sure, fairly soon. The idea with this is to focus again on that IEC standards, the international standards, and take a pragmatic approach, as it says, to cyber, looking across the entire life cycle and then using the concepts, ideas that are expressed in the standards and applying them into an actual operational world, operational environment, making sure the concepts, techniques that are espoused in the standard does get used and implemented in operations and in plans. So that's the whole focus of the book. One aspect of the book is cybersecurity metrics, which is our focus for today. And we'll certainly emphasize that as we go through. So who am I? You get a chance to see what I look like when I put a tie on. There you go. I can't see all you folks out there, but again, welcome. Glad to have you on board here. Some of my academic background. I've had a good year in terms of Villanova with the basketball team over the last year. Been in IT for 30 plus years, 35 or so. Most recently, the last 10, 15 years, focused on cybersecurity. A number of certs there and trying to make sure that the standards, again, and the applications and best practices are actually done out there in the real world. Okay, so we're going to talk specifically about today. Let's start with the standard, talk about what's in there, the security levels, talk about zones, conduits, how they are organized, how that approach can lead you to the selection of metrics, and then look at things from a threat landscape standpoint. What threats are out there? Because if we're going to try to mitigate something and measure it with a metric against a cybersecurity perspective, we really want to understand what kind of threats we are trying to thwart with those things. And then we'll look at the metrics themselves, evaluate, correlate quality. There's a lot of aspects to metrics, making sure I've got the right ones and then I can collect them and do this in a repeatable way. And then also that I'm managing risk. I mean, ultimately, cybersecurity is about risk mitigation, risk management. You want to reduce the risk to your operations, to your plant, to your staff, your folks, your people, and do that in a organized manner. You don't have unlimited time or budget. So the idea here, making sure that what we are looking at and measuring does reduce our organizational risk. And then we'll look at the organizational maturity as you're rolling these kind of programs out. All right. And I guess I should mention that if anyone has any questions there, please use the chat box, drop them in there. We'll collect them. I could either address them as we go through, or we'll certainly try to make sure we answer any questions at the end, or even afterwards through email and such. We'll be able to try to get all those questions answered as they would pop up. So what does this international standard look like? The IEC 62443 really has origins back in ISA, the International Society of Automation, and the IEC stands for the International Electrotechnical Commission. And basically, international standards bodies individuals, from vendors, plants, operators, marketplaces. We have a number of our engineers here that sit on the working groups that participate in the generation of what these standards will be to bring that kind of industry perspective. And the point to take away from this is the fact that the organization of the standard, it's not just one book, it's not just one dictionary, if you will, multiple levels, and they've organized it this way with the idea and thought being that cyber being so fast changing, you should be able to manage and alter things as the industry, as threats emerge and so forth. So the book or the standard is broken up into these series of books from a general perspective, some of the terminology, policies and procedures. How do I establish a security program in the first place? And then how do I manage patches, certainly in an industrial automation control system environment? And then what kind of technologies do I want to use? We'll talk further here in a chart or two about the zones and conduits, and also security requirements. What do I want to have as a requirement? And can I target those requirements against my specific architecture? And then make sure, again, that the metrics that I'm measuring are going to support those. And then taking things down to a component level. Do I have things that I can understand what's happening at the device level and then also at the enterprise level? So that's how the standard is organized, if you will. And the 1-3 document focuses on compliance metrics. The thought here, definition, is that I'm going to have a system under consideration. So you're going to have an organization, a plant, an operational situation there, and you're going to want to characterize that in terms of what I've got from an enterprise architecture perspective, and then taking that down to individual devices. Organize that by some type of security zone so I could break that architecture into manageable component pieces. And then look at conduits, basically just the transfer of information from one zone to another zone. Invariably, cyber and weaknesses, vulnerabilities come up when I'm moving data from one zone to another zone. And it's that perimeter or that boundary that usually requires additional attention to make sure that nothing's being exploited there. So we have that kind of background basis there from the standard, and there's other definitions, and it talks in there about system modeling approaches and quality aspects of metrics and so forth. So there's certainly a lot more information characterized in that particular document. It also characterizes then these 3 types of security levels. So first off, that if I've got an organization broken up in these type of architectures, these zones, I want to do some sort of risk assessment and then characterize what do I want to have for a target level. Is this a device that's going to control a process, chemicals that might be something that could explode, or is this maybe just information that I need to manage? I may have a different security level I'd want depending on what the data, the intellectual property, the other assets you have in there that I'm trying to protect. So you start off with the target, and then the capability as I'm actually building, designing, putting in features. It could be through a mix of software, hardware, process, people, technology, a lot of different ways of getting features in there. The capability then, how well you're doing. And then finally, the achieved level. When I put this into operations and I've actually got things running and I'm collecting the data and the metrics and I've got system log data moving and so forth, have I achieved what I've set out to do in terms of what my target level should be? So that's some background there. Moving further then, 5 security levels, and I should emphasize this is a draft version. Anything with the standard here, as I mentioned, is the idea it being changing over time. A lot of draft versions of different aspects of this, and this is what's here currently, and there may be some changes to that, but the important takeaway is that if you consider things from a security level perspective, let's say security level 0, where I really don't have any protections, probably not a really great place to be, up to a security level 4, which would be considered often a nation state, where you've got professionals through some sort of country or organization that use sophisticated means, which would often be something they're developing their own attack metrics or their attack vectors, attack code, they're developing malware, they have resources and capabilities and a lot of specific skills and motivation. You know, it could be financial or it could be otherwise. So if you look at this from the perspective of these multiple levels here, the architect of the cyber perspective is trying to understand what of these, based on a particular security zone, do I have to implement? How far do I have to go? How many requirements, how many security features do I need to put into place to protect my architecture, my operations, my people, my plant, materials against cyber threats? So we'll continue down that vein here, pointing back to our standard. So security levels and capabilities. The whole thought with this is that the 62443 defines what they call foundational requirements, and they've got the 7 categories, if you will, listed here. Things that should be familiar to anyone that's been in and around cybersecurity over the last few years. Identification, authentication, user control, integrity, confidentiality, and so forth. So thought here, organization of requirements as a foundation. And then if I've got a security level, let's say of 1, I'm going to have a certain number of requirements that would be things that I would want to make sure that I've enabled. So you could almost look at that like an audit. If I want to go in here and I've got a particular zone, I've characterized as security level 1, I would want to be able to satisfy all the requirements in that column for security level 1, as opposed to maybe something that might be more up the scale, if you will, security level 4, as we talked, nation state. So I want to have the most comprehensive set of controls in place to be able to make sure that I can mitigate the most amount of threats and also reduce the level of vulnerabilities there. So the standard helps in the sense that I've got a quantified set of requirements I could look at. And if you actually would pull the standard, you could read the actual wording in there for each of those foundational requirement types. And here's just the quantities. So you could see how many different things you would want to bring into play if you're trying to protect your plant and installation against nation state attack versus maybe just some malware that might be existing out there on the internet and so forth. All right. Security levels, zones, and conduits. As I mentioned, big part of the standard is trying to look at things from an enterprise perspective. How do I break down this organization? One of the most recent places I had worked and supported was Department of Commerce that had over 10,000 user and end user devices, laptops, and just computers and other things that were distributed around the globe. So you have the scalability issue. You have a large enterprise. So how do I break that down and differentiate that based on what that particular either business unit's doing or plant is doing in this case? So the thought is enterprise zone, maybe your IT from your corporation is going to be sharing out information there, but at a particular plant, which could be a different geography, or it could be within one plant at one geography, but it's an architectural construct, if you will, that allows you to say, I've got differing zones here. So there's plant A, plant B, plant C, and so forth. I can segment those things, network segmentation through firewalls, routers, and other IT type network devices. From a cyber metrics perspective, I'm going to want to have things that I can measure and look at against each of those different zones. So the thought process here is to be able to break these things apart, target a security level against each of those that is commensurate or is something that's applicable to your plant, your company, your organization, your geography, your market, all these different things. When you look at it, though, from a cyber metrics perspective, you're really taking the same kind of approach, whether you're either in, let's say, financial services or healthcare or industrial control systems. You can use the same approach here in trying to break things apart, understanding how data is stored, how data is transferred, and then what type of cyber metrics and protections I'm going to put in place, and then make sure that I've got the network segmented here so that the traffic and the zones and the conduits are appropriately protected based on what my security target level is. Hopefully that makes sense to everyone then. So the idea in doing all of that is, again, stepping back and trying to do from a security architecture standpoint, have I integrated all these things? So systems engineering approaches, just standard life cycle approaches for how to build and engineer systems, whether they be IT systems or physical systems. The idea is to be able to go across the life cycle and make sure that I've got metrics that not only can help me in building and designing the system as I'm laying out those zones and making sure that I understand data transfer, data storage, and so forth, but also support operations where I may not have the same capability to take something down or offline. I may have different issues with patching, and I may have different service level agreements. So I want to be able to ensure that I've got an engineering approach across the life cycle, and invariably having metrics that can look against, in this case, vulnerabilities. A lot of different vulnerabilities are already identified that are known. US CERT, DHS, and other vendors, commercial vendors, certainly will make vulnerabilities of their products and their devices known. And these are things that certainly that should be searched and characterized, understood. If you've done your architectural modeling and you've done your zone establishment, you should know what devices you have, what users are accessing, and then also data flow and transfers. So with those, I would be able to characterize what are the vulnerabilities now I'm worrying about based on what vendors I've got, based on what traffic flows and so forth. So I've got known vulnerabilities, but of course the challenge is, what do I do about those unknowns, those zero-day exploits? Of people have heard those. Most famous case, of course, in the industrial control world, Stuxnet, a number of years ago now, where a number of zero-day exploits that were unknown in the general community, were used to create access points for individuals to be able to compromise a system, get administrator account access privilege, and then pivot within networks and move on and do all those things. So vulnerabilities here, again, back to your zones, trying to understand what are the threats, what are the vulnerabilities I have to protect against, and do I have to worry about something like an advanced persistent threat, which would be a nation state attack. The idea there being characterized that it could be, one phrase often used is low and slow, right? Where I want to compromise a system, I don't want to be known that it's been compromised. So I may just insert some software, make sure that I can communicate, and then I want to do uploads and downloads over time, do some sort of beaconing out, command and control, and over time be able to then mount a campaign against whatever my target, whatever my adversary there is. So a whole range of vulnerabilities here. Certainly patching should be able to handle known vulnerabilities, but if you have to worry about advanced persistent threats, that's where things come into play, that you may need some more sophisticated means of protections. Hence, situational awareness, trying to understand, again, back to, you can't protect what you don't understand you have. So one of the first basic precepts is to have an inventory, to understand, to be able to build a diagram like this for your particular enterprise, for your network, for your domains, for your user devices, your laptops, all the things that are there. And then identify, for instance, where is internet connectivity provided? How do users and devices access data? Do I have, for instance, some programmable logic controller device that has to get a firmware update from an internet site? Do I have a protected mechanism to be able to get that software, that file, into that device? So situational awareness, back to understanding, first off, your network, your enterprise, your devices, and then also the threats and exploits. You could put a laundry list of things out here. Some of these you may have to worry about, others you may not have to, but you should be able to, if you're doing network segmentation, point to security controls and features you've implemented that should be able to thwart those type of threats that you would be able to see out there in the wild and so forth. So again, the focus, architectural perspective, understanding your enterprise, what your business unit, your plan, or your headquarters has to be protected against, and then looking for those relevant threats. Not all the threats that are out there may be relevant to your particular industry or domain, but then understanding the threats, the vulnerabilities, and then being able to characterize and mitigate those things as appropriate. So, all right. So the threat landscape, big challenge industrial control systems is if I've got IT networks, enterprise networks where I may be having email and sharing out corporate information, and then I cross over operations technology world. Big focal point differences here often come down to IT worrying about intellectual property. I've got data, I've got assets being stored. I want to make sure that it's not compromised. I've got user account information, I've got passwords, I've got trade secrets, things of that nature. And I want to make sure that they're only revealed to employees and appropriate contractors. OT world operations, I've got the same sort of infrastructure, but here I'm transitioning or moving into a physical plant environment. And let's just say if I've got some chemical plant and I'm actually mixing things and I'm creating materials and chemicals that could be explosive in nature, I may have processes that I don't easily shut down. So the availability may then come to the forefront in the sense that I have to make sure I have to have that process running 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. I can't just take it down to reboot a server. So you have a different perspective and then also corresponding different threats. So IT worrying again, raw data, aggregating data as information is being manipulated and used internally for business purposes. Things that also come into play are contracts and other supporting documents for the enterprise. Often here, office environments, user devices we're all familiar with that we've got on all our desks currently. There may be a cloud aspect. You may have certain data and applications that are not handled through corporate data centers. They may be through a third party. These could be done through some kind of virtual LANs or some sort of tunneling using protocols that allows you to maintain secure communications. And also remote users. So it may have servers and other firewalls and information and devices protecting the network. But then I have to worry about things like, how do I know a remote user is who they say they are? The authentication of those remote users becomes critical. And the OT operations, as we mentioned, with plants and environments, different unique devices. You may have here different protocols. They might require different security controls, and you may not actually be able to control some of the assets in the same way. If I've got a process that's starting, it may have to continue on. I can't just shut these things down. I can't just apply patches, even though there may be some critical patch that's been identified. So here, having some patch management scheme in place, and then understanding what kind of service level agreement I'm providing. So threat landscapes, these kind of environments, using the international standards now, looking at what type of metrics can I use to bring into these environments that's going to allow me to assess how well I am protecting these environments and how secure actually am I making my operations here. So there are numerous cyber threats out there, more emerging every day. Things people have probably heard of, the spyware, malware, things that are out there. The internet brings good and negatives. There are marketplaces where you can find readily available software that can allow you to compromise user accounts or crack passwords or whatever. So those things are out there that could be used, for research purposes and then also for nefarious purposes. And things such as spear phishing, social engineering threats, your users being targeted. Why are users targeted? Because they're the keys in the sense of user IDs and then passwords. If I can compromise an administrative account, I've got access now to additional capabilities that allow me to do things as an attacker that I would like to do to keep myself maybe hidden in terms of changing passwords, creating new user groups, deleting activities, deleting system logs, all those type of things out there. So the idea of cybersecurity and threat exploitation and mitigation is if I understand what threats I've got, the things that are out here, I can start to go back to those foundational requirements again and look at what type of controls do I have to put into place in order to mitigate those. So it can be more of an engineering approach and trying to do an audit, in the sense that if I have to worry about denial of service type attacks, I want to have metrics and indicators that will let me know when I am being under attack from denial of service. It can be done through different thresholds, different metrics, different ways of looking at that. But the idea here, the thought is that take some time to think about and consider what are the greatest threats that your environment, your devices, your user community is going to face. Is there a lot of web interaction? Do you use web applications to enable your functionality? You may be more susceptible to SQL injection or those type of attacks. So, and if I've got a pretty good perspective on what my users are doing, what my business is doing and producing, I can go back and look at those threats and then try to make sure that I've got proper security controls in place. And as it says there, the challenge you have as a defender is having to defend against all different type of attacks, whereas the attacker, if I can compromise one system, one user, one device, I may be able to pivot or leverage that into other things and exploit other weaknesses and other vulnerabilities. And the elevation of privilege and getting to an administrative account is something all attackers want to do because of the capabilities that account brings. Think about what your users do internally for you. Think about those users not being your authorized users or employees or contractors, but a malicious actor. And think about then what those activities are that could be compromised. So thinking through your threats, thinking through your zones and conduits again that you've got defined there, and then what kind of threats do I want to mitigate against? All right, so metrics. The whole idea of metrics is I want to be able to do something and measure my effectiveness, measure my security controls, measure my security program, measure how well I'm doing at maybe one point in time, but then maybe perhaps, hopefully, also over time. So I can look for trends and different type of things to see, am I really improving my security posture? Usually senior management's going to ask those kind of questions. Becomes a return on investment type approach. If I'm spending this much on cyber, what am I getting for that? Can I quantify what my security level of protection is and why I need more controls, and over time, am I getting better? Here's where metrics can come in and can allow you to tell a compelling story, justify budgets, justify new tools, new technology, and so forth. So the foundational requirements, back to the standards there, the 1 through 7 that were mentioned earlier, the names, user ID authentication, user control, system integrity, and so forth. Usually looking at things then from a threat type. What can happen if I manipulate a user ID? I don't know, for instance, that a remote user is properly authenticated. How do I know if someone out there says, John Smith, I work company ABC, I'm logging in as a remote user, grant me all these privileges and credentials to do something? So your biggest threat from that kind of aspect is spoofing, which would be someone that is impersonating a legitimate user or legitimate credentials. In terms of trying to apply technology then, a lot of different ways of doing that. Here's where, creativity can be good, vendors of new products, there's training aspects, different things you can bring into play. So if I've got a foundational requirement and I know what I'm trying to protect against, I can then better select what I want to do to mitigate that. So multi-factor user authentication, and probably everybody's been exposed to these type of things now, where I've got multiple factors. User ID password is one thing, but then I may ask for some sort of passcode that might come through a cell phone, a mobile device, some other something that you've got that is not part of user ID password that would have data that's stored in a network. If I've got another physical device, I've got another factor of authentication, harder to compromise. You may do different things with software, password generation. There's software out there that can manage your software, put things into a vault in terms of what passwords are there. Other organizational things, segregating of duties, A lot of these are, if you will, standard, if there is such a thing, cybersecurity practices or best practices. So the mitigation techniques, now going against those foundational requirements, once those are identified, the idea or thought with the metrics is, how do I measure this? Here's where things get maybe a little bit more challenging. So if I have a framework and I've got the standards out there that define the things I should be worried about, I've thought through the threats, and then I've got some ways of mitigating those, how do I measure how well I'm doing? So potential metrics, a lot of different ways and techniques and things you can do here. I'm looking for something I can measure. Logins, how many do I normally have? Can I establish what my business norm typically is? And then if I start to see that average number go up, or I start to see the number of incorrect logins going up substantially, it could be an indication of an attack. It could be an indication that you hired a lot of new users that can't remember their passwords. So the cause of some of these things can be challenging to figure out. But the thought is, if I have a metric that's focused on that one factor here, that foundational requirement, I can at least know where to look and then try to spend more time as an analyst or an incident responder and take a look at those and see, is this really an issue, or is it just something that happened based on business conditions or other things? So there's a list of other things here. Metrics can come from products, people. You can build custom software. A lot of things cybersecurity products will generate for you just right out of the box. So which to turn on, which to look at, which to pay attention to, that becomes the challenge. A lot of the cyber exploits that we've seen and read about over the last few years, it turns out they had a lot of great monitoring tools in place, but maybe they had too many. They had too many alerts, too much data moving, too many things to look at. So the thought process here is try to use, again, going back to the standard, trying to drive that framework and then picking out and focusing on which of all of these possible things to measure is going to yield the most benefit for my environment based on the way I've done my kind of architectural modeling and approach here. So that's the thought process for all of this. Okay. Log events. Logging of events is one of the foundational aspects to really being able to get your hands around good cybersecurity metrics. Operational effectiveness really comes off of and keys off of having log events. So when a user logs in, that timestamp gets noted, the user ID gets noted. When a process fails, it gets noted. When data gets moved from device A to device B, there's a system log entry that says, here's the amount, here's where the data went from and to, IP addresses, destinations, origins, so forth. So log events are really essential often to being able to look back. Let's say you've had an incident, or let's just say you're trying to understand what your normal operations are. Log events gives you that kind of insight, that ability to drill deeper and understand what users are doing, what processes are doing, what applications are doing, and how those events and how that traffic moves. The correlation then becomes, do I understand, cause and effect? Do I understand that this user logged in, then this user moved this data was stored here, caused this process to start, and so forth. So laundry list here, some of the different type of events. Lots of different ways, again, of looking at metrics. Some events may be, the first time you see something, like I brought a new system online, there's a new login failure, or there may be something here that's sort of a threshold. If I see this, I want to have a closer look at it, even if it's only the first time. As contrasted with maybe something that's, an event stream. I mean, you expect a certain number of events and failures and, system log events and people putting in incorrect data, applications going the wrong place or whichever. So a lot of different ways here of trying to look at things over time to find out, have I really crossed some sort of threshold? Am I trying to go against an IP address there that I've never seen before? I've never had anyone in the enterprise use that Is this a new device, a new application, a new contractor, or is it an attacker that's got some sort of command and control beaconing? So if I can put a metric there and look for those type of things, gives me some better operational effectiveness. And then, of course, with any kind of events and all this data, you're looking at really, statistics. Is there an increase? What percentage of an increase am I going to start to worry about? User logon failures goes up 5%. Is that normal? It goes up 10%, 20, 30, pick a number. Invariably in here, the better you understand, again, your environment, the way you normally operate, gives you better insight as to what type of metric to put and then what to look against here. Is a 10% increase something I'm going to worry about or not? There may be other things here, lots of different products, protections you can put in place. Maybe new IP addresses could certainly be associated with new websites, new capabilities, new devices, new things that you've put into your environment. But there are services that can allow you also, based on what they see out there in the wild, and protect you. Blacklist. This IP address has been known to contain malware. Well, let's not go there. Let's make sure we've got the identification of that, and then it's handled, and that IP address then can be blocked, and so forth. So you can do things then, events can be from an application perspective, from a user perspective. The idea with all of these things is going back to your log events and trying to make sure that I've got good insight there as to what's going on in terms of my operations in my particular plant. All right, so what makes a good metric? Easier said than done, right? So I want to make sure, first off, consistent methodology for collection. I want to be able to depend on this. If I'm counting the number of, let's say logon failures, I want to make sure that from Monday to Tuesday to Wednesday, I am collecting that and counting the same thing in the same way. So this is where, again, the standard, going back to, if you remember that level 1, that IEC 62443, talks about what makes a good metric. There's insights in there that talk through some of these things, making sure that I've got a clear, ambiguous metric. So I understand, for instance, if I'm moving data in a packet switch network, what's the response time? Is it from the receipt of the first packet or from the receipt of the last packet? These things can drastically change. So you want to make sure that you're collecting all your data, all your metrics in a consistent manner over time. The reason for that, I want to be able to do comparisons, certainly in my own organization, maybe within my plants. Maybe I compare it with other organizations and make sure that I've got consistency there. And the other thing to consider is that when there's an incident, invariably what we're doing now is I want to look backwards. So I've got my log data, hopefully with appropriate timestamps, and can I go backwards in time and correlate events and understand what happened when in terms of how my network may have been compromised and so forth. So consider what makes a good metric there. And then in terms, again, of which ones, let's not forget about our cybersecurity policies. You may have organizational policies that talk about how often you do scans looking for those vulnerabilities, how often I do patches, how often I do audits. You may have organizational policies you have to be compliant with. You may have federal standards. You may have organizational norms. You may have legal requirements, a lot of things here that would dictate when and how often to collect all those metrics. And then in terms of the evaluation, consider well, who uses this metric? I may have a different metric if I'm an OT engineer or an analyst, if I'm a cyber engineer or cyber person versus the CIO or CEO of an organization. May have a different type of data that's being collected there. And then in terms of what, when, where do I get these, how often, and who is going to be the consumer of this? Can I produce reports, again, in a consistent manner? And do I have some identification, some thought process about what I consider to be compliant or out of compliance in terms of threshold values? What's above and below? And what am I going to indicate as a problem? A lot of again, these cyber exploits and situations we've seen and heard reported in the news over the last few years, when you look back, it's often pretty illuminating how much data was being moved over time. And it may not have been one particular day, but over time, you could see a trend. And if I've got some threshold value based on a user ID or application or device, and I start accumulating and saying, well, how much data normally moves here? And then have some sort of indication for, this seems like it's out of compliance or out of a norm. I may then want to spend additional time and take a closer look. What's really going on right there? And using these metrics to drive your operational effectiveness. All right, bring in some additional colors here. We've got some oranges and yellows and greens since we're at fall here in terms of where we are on the seasonal calendar. Let's not always forget that risk management is a fundamental precept of cybersecurity. Why am I doing and looking at all these things? I really can never say, I might like to, but I can never really say that I've built a system here, it's bulletproof. You've got defense in depth, you've got a lot of different things you're looking at from a cyber perspective. You're going to try to have multiple perimeter defenses, multiple controls. And why am I doing all this? I'm really just trying to reduce the risk. You know, what's the likelihood of being attacked? What's the impact if something is compromised? And again, going back to those threats, and if I can understand what my threat environment is based on that architecture zone and based on how data moves across conduits, that's going to give me a better insight here as to what metrics to choose that's going to allow me to manage my risk. So risk management, basically, you want to try to understand where could I be breached, where could data leave, how can I be compromised, when can malware get in, how data can be moved in a manner I don't expect or certainly don't want. And the whole idea here is trying to reduce the likelihood, how often this event might occur, and then also trying to reduce the impact. If there is an issue or I am compromised, have I minimized the harm? So if I've segmented my network into different zones and one of those zones is compromised, what can that administrator do in there? I can reduce the magnitude of harm if that one admin account cannot access all of the data in all of the other architecture zones. So by doing network segmentation, I'm actually reducing the risk again and focusing on making sure my operational effectiveness is as high as I could possibly make it there. So, okay, robust security metrics. What is a metric? Again, data, information. We've talked some aspects of quality and making sure I've got consistency in how it's characterized, how it's gathered, and so forth. Really, what I want to do with these things, I want to make sure I'm getting appropriate data to people, and I'm going to facilitate insight. The whole thought process here, I want to be able to put numbers and measures against something that's often hard to measure, like how well am I protected? From a cybersecurity perspective of an enterprise, do I have enough in place? Do I have enough controls? Are the controls in the right locations? Do I have enough devices? Do I have user controls? So the insight from the metrics is what you're trying to look at. Do I understand what's going on with people, process, and technology? People aspect, you know, I'm hiring new people, I have new contractors. Do I understand how they're brought into the system, how they are granted those administrative and other accesses? Do I understand the process of how things are done? Do I understand what people do in terms of the jobs? Do I understand the physical process? So that the metric then, being able to look at things for, am I in a threshold, in compliant or not? And those vulnerabilities, as we mentioned, understanding things that are out there as DHS and US CERT vendors report on these things. You can subscribe to newsletters. You get alerts based on devices. Here's a new vulnerability that's been reported. These things are characterized and enumerated. MITRE and others maintain databases out there. You can actually go and look up, you know, these CVEs, these common vulnerability enumerations. And those things gives you insight as to what has been reported, and then moreover, what to do about it. How important is it to do? What's the priority? And then what activities or what software you might have to update in order to mitigate that. And then that one there about your supply chain. Probably anybody that's been in cyber over the last few days, weeks has heard about this Supermicro motherboard compromise, whether it's real or not. The thought process, and this has always been an issue, DoD and the intelligence community, is supply chain. Do I understand where in an IT environment a motherboard is composed of lots of different components, the chips, the resistors, the network cards, all the ability to move data in and out and do the processing and inserting the operating system and so forth. From a supply chain standpoint, do I understand everything that's in my plant, my environment? Do I know where it came from? Am I purchasing laptops from reputable device manufacturers? Do they know, and can they tell me where their component pieces came from? So trying to track your supply chain back, again, thinking about foundational requirements, worrying about what's my security level, and where do I really have to focus on making sure that I don't have any compromises in that supply chain process that could lead to these vulnerabilities. And then in terms of metrics and categories, application security, networks, one way of looking at this is, an OSI, network layers of protection, worrying about things down at the lowest data transmission level all the way up to the application security. Do I have metrics and data here? That's going to give me insight. So I can track data movements, I can track devices, I can track people, I can look at what help desk is doing and so forth. And the idea with this is that you're just trying to provide yourself, again, insight to what your organization is doing on a normal basis, and then for things that are out of the ordinary. And one thing that's out of the ordinary would be breach detection. How do I detect breaches? A couple different ways, passive, active. I'm looking for behavior that's, again, outside of the norm. Those things we had talked about a little bit, first-time events, data movement, data being replicated, DNS queries going out to servers, IP addresses I hadn't seen before. So a lot of these things, as data movement there, uncovering these kind of threats, as it says at line speed, you may have to automate this. And this is where technology can come to your benefit, come into play, looking for products, whether they be firewalls, IDS, IPS type systems, detecting and preventing those type of threats that could actually look at packets as they're moving and then look at a context for the packet and try to understand what is going on here. Again, trying to understand what's normal, what's not normal. And then the active detection, talked about logs, having that log data, the log data being a core part of your cyber metrics. A lot of the metrics you're looking at as you characterize and trying to go back to what you're trying to mitigate against come off of those logs. I can pre-filter, pre-screen those. I can have thresholds. I can build essentially rule sets. Allow those rules to indicate, oh, here's something that someone should take a closer look at. And the idea with this and the products is use software, use these tools to your benefit. Aggregate volumes of data, which can be, voluminous when you're talking at enterprise level. Aggregate all that data and then make sure that I've got those thresholds, those alerts activated in there so that I can get some insight as to what's going on. And then maybe we want to use something like that DLP, the data loss prevention, and may actually tag different data sources. I want to know every person, every account that touches a particular record. Healthcare and others will use this because you may have HIPAA or other legal restrictions. You have to prove who's accessing things based on privacy rules or privacy laws. So there's often an overarching legal reason to have these kind of things. But from standpoint here, indicating if there may have been a breach and trying to use those metrics to give you better insights to what's going on there. All right, so trying to summarize or stepping back a little bit again, how do I build these robust security architectures? We talked a lot about the metrics and what's quality metrics, the collection of them, consistency. So, 3 characterizations here. Do I have good sources of data? Do I understand where the data is coming from? Can I trust the data source? Is it a consistent source? Am I utilizing the data in the same manner? If I'm using software and I've got rules and I'm aggregating those things, am I using them in the same way over time so that I've got a proper, time-based series analysis of those metrics? And visualizations, I mean, these days, there's a lot of products that will come up, out of the box. They'll provide you with a dashboard, and they may use colors or other things, the green, yellow, red in terms of, good, bad, take a look. Visualizations can be a great shorthand way, but if I've got this whole metric sense going back to what those foundational requirements are talking, visualizations then becomes that sort of pointy edge of the spear in terms of, oh, here's a threshold. This particular metric went red. What's going on here? And I want to take a closer look at that. So then, do I understand the metric? Do I know where it comes from? Is it verified? Is it repeatable? And all those kind of things then come into play. Trying to sift through a lot of data and then make sure that I'm making good operational decisions based on what metrics I see that's out there. Okay. So going through all those things, talking about, the standards, the frameworks, the foundational requirements, trying to identify appropriate metrics that you can use to quantify and mitigate against the threats. You've done some threat analysis, threat modeling, then to look at that. Another way of looking at this, or again, stepping back, is that it can be overwhelming. There's so many things here, but look at it from, I'm an organization. Organizations have maturity levels. So I'm starting out in the security program. I'll be starting out at the basic. I just want to do things maybe in some ad hoc manner. Over time, though, I want to make sure that I've got some consistency. I've got policies. I've got objectives. So one other thing the standards can help us with is it formally defines levels for your organization in terms of what maturity you've got based on how well you're able to build and manage an overarching security process. So when I move up to something that's, let's say, a level 4, I've got metrics in place, good service providers, I understand where they come from. I also have a feedback loop. So as I look at different things, I can adjust my thresholds, adjust my data. So the idea over time is making sure that the program I have in place for my organization is what the organization needs, not some other organization, but what my organization needs based on maybe an enterprise level, a plant level, user groups, business units, however your enterprise is organized. So this is where you can go back to your security policy or things that are overarching and say, am I providing the metrics for my organization based on all those different dimensions that's going to support what the organization needs to do? So there you have it. Cybersecurity standards, using an international standard, and it's truly international. People support this from around the globe. Consultants, vendors, people in different industries. So using that as a basis, looking at the way that they use security levels in their foundational requirements, organization of zones, network segmentation, those kind of architectural principles to define what the environment is. And then situational awareness. What industry are you in? What kind of data do you have to protect? What do your users do? And then looking at that to identify and select those metrics that can reduce your risk. There you go. I mean, it's that simple and that complicated all at the same time, right? Okay. I'd like to thank all of you for listening to me go on about this topic. Near and dear to my heart, of protecting of data and people and process. Technology should be used for what it's been built for, should not be compromised. Got an email address there. Please drop me a note if you have any particular questions. I am out there on Twitter, believe it or not. There is a pretty deep and wide range of people like myself that post on different cyber topics, what's in the news, what they've seen. Good exposure to a lot of data. And then exida also, we write blog posts and of course webinars like this. So I'd be remiss if I didn't then say, If you like this one, well, we've got more, right? So Exida Academy has got other classes. We do things, a lot of training, trying to provide this kind of perspective out there to the industry. Since we have a number of our folks that are so close to these standards, try to, as I did here with hopefully with cybermetrics, try to do this also from a functional safety and other perspectives. And we've got all sorts of locations and dates. Please visit the website to see the full schedule. And then we do other things, seminars. My good buddy Patrick here, a recent Penn State grad, is now out in California and will be out again in November 7th here. These kind of seminars are typically done, you know, some local hotel, whatever, at the places there, give you some insight, functional safety, cyber seminars, different things, mix of different topics, so forth. And also, I'd be remiss if I did not point out that we are going to Paducah, Kentucky. My good buddy Dave Gunter here, who's our cyber director for the company, will be out there talking about standards, trends, and a life cycle approach. So Dave's a long-term ICS guy, and he'll give you some personal insights there about what he's seen in Paducah, Kentucky. And again, please look on our website for other locations. So if you'd like to know anything more, please also, I had my Twitter contact there, but certainly the company's got one, and Facebook and LinkedIn and all these kind of things. And if you have suggestions for future topics, webinars, please drop a note to the Academy at Exida, and I look forward to hearing from you. And unless I'm missing something here, I don't see that we have any active questions at the time, so please feel free to drop me an email or again the Exida Academy, and be happy to address those kind of things. And looks like we're running out of time. I thank everyone for their attention. Hopefully you learned a couple of things, hopefully more than one thing here. And good luck with your cyber protections, and I wish you all the best from implementing those security controls and doing it in an organized manner going forward. So thanks again for your attention. If anyone has any questions, I'll be on the chat room here for a little bit further. But I think at this point we can stop the recording and see you guys next time. Thanks a lot. Take care.